I had always thought that by the age of 74, a man should live a measured and quiet life, enjoying the fruits of his labors. But fate seems to have decided to give me new trials, as if youth were not enough to test my character. My name is Hubert Campbell, and for 30 years I have lived in Ontario, where I moved with my late wife Rosemary in the 90s, when I was promoted to senior manager of the credit department at the local branch of the Northern Trust Bank. I remember that time like yesterday, workdays filled with a stream of numbers, clients, and eternal checks, and after, quiet evenings with Rosemary in our small but so cozy house on River Street. 2 decades flew by like a day. I retired almost 15 years ago, well saved and with a reputation for knowing a lot, if not everything, about the banking system. As my colleagues saw me off, the branch manager, Stanley Prentice, a nice fellow, though 20 years younger, shook my hand and said, "Hubert, you are the only person I would trust with the keys to my safe." I think of those words often, especially now that my own family doesn't seem to trust me to manage even my money. But more about that later. Rosemary left me 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, a diagnosis that doctors pronounce with that special look on their faces that immediately makes it clear there is no hope. She held on with dignity, my beautiful Rosemary, remaining as caring and strong to the end as she had been all our lives together. "Cheer up, you old grouch," she said to me one of the last days when she noticed the tears in my eyes. "Live the rest of it with dignity. And don't let Leonard forget that you're his father, not some distant relative." Leonard is our only son. 48 years old, an employee of a telecommunications company. He's always been a smart guy, but somewhat indecisive. I put it down to his generation. They seemed in no hurry to grow up. At 35, Leonard was still single, though he had girlfriends regularly. He could not build a serious relationship with any of them, and Rosemary and I had already resigned ourselves to the idea that we might not have grandchildren. And then there was Astrid Fallon, a 38-year-old public relations consultant with bright red hair and green eyes that seemed to be constantly calculating something. She flew into Leonard's life like a hurricane, and within 6 months they announced their engagement. Rosemary was already very ill at the time, but found the strength to attend their wedding. "There is something predatory in this girl," my wife whispered to me during the celebration, but I brushed it off, writing it off as fatigue and illness. I realize now that Rosemary, as always, was more perceptive than I was. The first signs that something was wrong with Astrid came shortly after my wife's death. Leonard suggested that I move in with them. They had a spacious house in the suburbs, and he said, I should not be alone in such a big house. I agreed reluctantly, but then grief clouded my mind, and the prospect of an empty house, where every corner reminded me of Rosemary, seemed unbearable. The house, by the way, wasn't big at all, a typical 3-bedroom suburban cottage. But Leonard needed an excuse to take me into his care. I realized now that the idea had come from Astrid, and it wasn't because she cared for her elderly father-in-law. The first weeks after the move went relatively smoothly. I was assigned a room on the first floor, which had previously been used as a guest room. Leonard was caring, but I noticed a gradual change in his tone when talking to me, as if he were talking to a child rather than a father. "Daddy, did you take your medicine?" "Daddy, don't forget to close the door when you go out in the yard." "Daddy, let me help you with that. You might not be able to handle it." At 74, with a healthy mind and a relatively strong body, I suddenly turned into an infirm old man, at least in my son's eyes. And then the money talk began. Astrid asked me carelessly at dinner one night how I managed my finances. "You realize, Hubert," she said, stirring her tea with a silver spoon, "at your age, it's hard to keep track of all those cards, accounts, payments. Maybe we should simplify the system. Leonard could help. I almost choked on my cabbage stew. 10 years in banking, and she tells me it's hard to keep track of cards? Me, who designed a credit risk tracking system for an entire branch." "Hey, Kim, thank you for your concern, Astrid, but I'm doing just fine with my finances," I replied as politely as possible. She smiled, that special smile that doesn't affect the eyes. "Of course, Hubert. Just a suggestion. You know how many scammers there are nowadays who prey on the elderly. The elderly bit me, but I kept my mouth shut." Leonard, who was sitting next to me, nodded approvingly. "Astrid's right, Dad. You should be more careful. Shouldn't you really put some of your money into our joint account? Just to be safe. That's when I first felt anxious. Not just annoyed at my daughter-in-law's prying, but really anxious. My son didn't even seem to realize the strangeness of the suggestion. I have no reason to worry about the safety of my account, I replied dryly. I'm quite financially literate. Of course, Dad, Leonard said, clearly trying to cover the awkwardness. Just think about it, okay? But it didn't end there. A week later, Astrid casually asked me if I'd gotten my pension. It seemed like an ordinary question, but the tone of the question made me suspicious. Yesterday, as usual, I replied. Why? No, nothing, she smiled her fake smile again. I just wanted to see if I needed help paying the bills. Maybe you'd be more comfortable giving the money to us, and we'll pay for everything? Us? Since when does my pension have to go through my sister-in-law's hands? I felt anger boiling up inside me, but I held back. I didn't want to make a scene. I'm perfectly capable of paying my bills, Astrid. What's more, I contributed to your roof repairs last month, if you remember. That was a direct jab. I did give Leonard $5,000 to repair the roof, even though it was their house, not mine. I had done it out of love for my son, but now for the first time I wondered where that money had actually gone. The new roof looked suspiciously modest for that amount of money. Astrid blushed slightly. Come on, Hubert, we're family. We just want to help. That evening I heard her and Leonard arguing in the bedroom. As I walked past, I slowed down. He's not going to give up control of his money, Astrid said. It's a lot of money, Leo. Think what we could do with that kind of money. Astrid, it's my father's money. Leonard's voice sounded uncertain. He has the right. Right? Astrid interrupted him. What right has he had to live on our dime for the last 3 months? Have you seen our electric bill? Our water bills? He sits at home all day, turning the heater on full blast, and we pay. And he's got $500,000 in the bank. I froze. $500,000? How did she know the amount of my savings? I had never discussed specific figures with her or Leonard. Moreover, I had different accounts in 2 banks, and no one knew the full picture of my financial situation but myself. You're exaggerating, I heard my son say. And besides, we were the ones who suggested he move. Because we thought he would contribute. A serious contribution, Leo. Not a handout like that $5,000 for the roof. You said yourself he's been saving all his life, and he's got plenty of money. I walked away from the door, feeling my back grow cold. So that's how it is. Astrid didn't see me as a family member, but as a source of income. And to make matters worse, it looked like she'd somehow gotten access to my account information. I stayed up that night thinking about what I'd heard. First thing in the morning, I called both banks to check the activity on my accounts. At Northern Trust, where I used to work, everything was fine. No suspicious transactions or inquiries. But the second bank, Western Reserve, informed me that 2 weeks ago, someone had tried to get information on my account, posing as my son and an authorized person. We certainly didn't provide the information without proper verification, Mr. Campbell, the operator assured me. Chapanidi. But maybe we should change the passwords and security questions. Just as a precaution. I took the advice, but the anxiety persisted. Who was trying to get my account information? Leonard or Astrid? And what were they planning to do with that information? Later that day, I decided to check my room to see if anyone had gone through my paperwork. Everything looked untouched, but the folder of bank statements I kept in the bottom drawer of my dresser wasn't lying the way I'd left it. Slightly shifted to the left, with the spine against the drawer wall, I'd always stacked it with the spine toward me, an old habit. Going through the documents, I didn't find anything missing, but I was sure someone had been looking through them. And that someone wasn't Paulina, the housekeeper who came twice a week. Why would she need my bank statements? But a family member. Given the conversation I'd had last night, it was an obvious candidate. At dinner, Astrid was unusually friendly. She asked me about my work at the bank, how the system had changed over the years. It must be very different now, mustn't it, Hubert? So much new technology, online banking, mobile apps. It must be hard for you to keep up with it all? I smiled the friendliest smile I could muster. Surprisingly, the principles are the same, Astrid, and I'm just as good with technology as the youngsters. Many of my former colleagues still consult me on various matters. It was true. I kept in touch with Stanley and some other Northern Trust staff. They did call occasionally to discuss some complex case, especially if it involved old banking practices. Really? Astrid was clearly surprised. And how often did they consult? Quite regularly, I lied, watching her reaction. Last week, for example, Stanley Prentice, he's the regional director now, called about an interesting client account situation. Astrid's gaze drifted to Leonard, who was devouring his steak with gusto, not really listening to our conversation. Wow, she said. What useful connections you have, Hubert. There was a note of concern in her voice. I realized I'd hit the mark. Astrid was concerned that I still had contacts in the banking industry. People who might notice something amiss if someone tried to manipulate my accounts. The next few days passed without incident, but I could feel my sister-in-law's eyes on me, assessing, calculating. She was clearly planning something, and it involved my money. I decided to prepare for any turn of events. First, I transferred most of the funds from my account at Western Reserve to an account at Northern Trust, where I was well known. Then I called Stanley and, as if by the way, mentioned my concerns. You know, at my age, you start to worry about strange things, I told him, like the fact that someone might try to get control of my finances. Stanley immediately realized what I was getting at. Hubert, I will personally make sure that no one can access your accounts without your direct orders. And if you want, we can set up additional security measures. I thanked him and accepted the offer. I felt a little more secure now, but my intuition told me that this was only the beginning of the problems. That evening, Astrid announced that she had found an excellent financial advisor for me. Ishkheim, he specializes in asset management for elderly clients, she announced over dinner. Many of his clients pass the management of their funds to their children or grandchildren. It's very convenient and safe. Really? I raised an eyebrow. And who is this miracle advisor? His name is Raymond Pierce. He's very experienced. He can come in any day next week. I pretended to consider the offer. You know, Astrid, I appreciate your concern, but I prefer to work with counselors from my former bank. They know my history, my preferences. Besides, I don't need a new asset management plan. My current one is working fine. Astrid's face contorted slightly, but she quickly pulled herself together. Whatever you want, Hubert. I just wanted to help. Leonard, who had been silent until then, suddenly intervened. Dad, I think you should at least listen to this Pierce guy. Astrid says he's very good at estate planning. Oh, that's it. Estate planning. It all makes sense now. I already have a will, Leonard, I said calmly, and it was drafted by a lawyer with 30 years of experience. But thank you for your concern. Astrid stood up abruptly from the table. I'll get dessert, she said, and went into the kitchen. When she came out, Leonard leaned toward me. Dad, Astrid's just worried about you. About all of us. We don't have as much money as you think. Mortgage, car loans. If you could help. I looked at my son with sadness. Doesn't he realize he's being used? That Astrid is manipulating him to get to my money? Leonard, I've always helped you when I could, and I will. But I'm not going to hand over control of my finances to anyone. Not a counselor, not you, not Astrid. It's my money, my hard-earned money, and I'll manage it as I see fit. Leonard pulled away, a look of hurt and disappointment on his face. You don't trust me, do you? You think I want to deceive you? I'm your son, Dad. No, this isn't about trust, Leonard. It's about principle. I'm still sane and capable of managing my own affairs. The conversation was interrupted when Astrid returned with apple pie. The atmosphere at the table became strained, and I soon apologized and retired to my room. Lying in bed, I reflected on how quickly things had changed. 6 months ago, I had been a respected father of the family, whose opinion was listened to. Now I had become the object of my daughter-in-law's financial manipulation, and my son seemed to be either an accomplice or an object of manipulation like me. My decision that morning was to be proactive. If Astrid was after my money, I had to protect not only myself, but also Leonard, who didn't seem to realize who he was involved with. I didn't know then how serious this battle would become, but I was prepared to use all my knowledge and experience to keep myself from being led. After all, it was not for nothing that I had worked for 10 years in a bank, dealing with the most cunning schemes of fraudsters and unscrupulous borrowers. The next 2 weeks passed in a tense lull. Astrid seemed to have decided to change tactics. Instead of talking directly about my finances, she began to methodically undermine my credibility in Leonard's eyes. It was so subtle, I didn't even notice at first. It started with little things. I was making myself breakfast in the common kitchen, as usual, and accidentally dropped a cup. No big deal, just an ordinary china cup. But when Astrid heard the clinking, she came running in with a look on her face like I'd started a fire at the very least. Surinam, oh my God, Hubert, she exclaimed, looking at the shards. What happened? The usual, I shrugged, bending down to pick up the broom. It slipped out of my hands. Astrid literally snatched the broom out of my hands. No, 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 don't. You could hurt yourself. I got it. Her tone was caring, but her eyes looked with anxious appraisal, as if I were an unreasonable child who couldn't handle the simplest task. Sharum, it's just a broken cup, Astrid. I'm perfectly capable of sweeping the floor. Of course you are, she was already sweeping, ignoring my words. It's just that lately you've been, a little awkward lately. That's normal at your age. I wanted to object, but I decided that it wasn't worth stirring up a conflict over such a small thing. However, that was only the first sign of trouble. That evening at dinner, Astrid casually remarked to Leonard, Honey, we should buy your father some plastic dishes. He broke his favorite cup today. He's probably having trouble holding things up. I looked up from my plate. I beg your pardon? Oh, Hubert, no offense. Astrid smiled her fake smile. It's perfectly normal. My grandfather also started dropping things when he turned 70. The doctor said it was a natural weakening of the grip reflex. My grip reflex is perfectly fine, I countered. The cup was wet and slipped out. It could happen to anyone, regardless of age. Leonard, who had been chewing silently, intervened. Dad, no one's saying there's anything wrong with you. It's just that plastic utensils are safer. Just in case. I looked at my son in disbelief. Did he really think that his 74-year-old father, who'd been fine with china all his life, suddenly needed plastic cups for kids? You don't need to change the dishes, I said firmly. I'm doing fine with what I have. That seemed to be the end of it. But I noticed the look Leonard and Astrid exchanged, a mixture of concern and condescension, as if I didn't understand my own condition. The next day, returning from my walk, I found my room reorganized. The night table had been moved closer to the bed. All the wires from my laptop and chargers had been neatly twisted and tucked into special holders, and there was a new rubber mat on the floor by the bed. What does all this mean? I asked Astrid, finding her in the living room. Oh, I just cleaned up, she said, looking away from her clipboard. Cleaned up anything you might have tripped over. You know, falls are the leading cause of injury in the elderly. I don't trip over wires, Astrid. My voice grew colder. And I prefer that no one touch my things without permission. Her face took on a hurt expression. Hubert, I'm just trying to help. You live in our house and I'm concerned for your safety. Our home. The phrase stung. Sure, technically it was their house. But didn't I give them 10 grand for a down payment? Not to mention the 5 grand to fix the roof. But I held back. I appreciate the concern, but in the future, please ask before you change anything in my room. Astrid nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she was not pleased with my disrespect for her endeavors. In the evening, I tried to talk to Leonard alone. He came home from work later than usual, and we met in the kitchen where he was looking for something to eat. Son, we need to talk, I began, when he finally sat down at the table with a sandwich. About what, Dad? He looked tired, not in the mood for a serious conversation. About Astrid, about the way she's been acting lately. Leonard sighed, setting the sandwich aside. What is it this time? She moved things around in my room without permission. She says it's for my safety. Leonard, she treats me like a feeble old man who can't take care of himself. The son rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture I knew well. It was what he always did when he was annoyed, but he tried to hide it. Dad, Astrid cares about you. Yes, she may be overly concerned, but that's because she cares. Would you rather she didn't care? That's not the point, I tried to find the words without sounding like an aggrieved old man. It's about respecting my autonomy, my privacy. I don't mind help when I need it, but don't act like I'm incapable of determining when I need that help and when I don't. Leonard sighed. All right, I'll talk to her. But you could also be a little more grateful. Astrid sacrifices a lot to make you comfortable in our home. I almost laughed. What does Astrid sacrifice? That she doesn't have complete control over my life and my finances? But I held back again. Of course, son. Thank you. And that was the end of the conversation. I could see that Leonard wasn't taking my concerns seriously. In his eyes, I was just a cranky old man who didn't appreciate the care of his beautiful wife. The next few days brought new improvements to my life. Special handrails appeared in the bathroom, although I had never complained of balance problems. My closet somehow ended up with comfortable rubber-soled slippers with Velcro closures, as if I couldn't handle regular laces. And one morning I discovered on the kitchen table a whole battery of pill boxes signed with the days of the week. "What are these?" I asked Astrid, who was tending to the stove. "Organizers for your medications," she answered without turning around. "I've noticed that you sometimes forget to take your pills on time." "I don't forget," I countered. "I have my own system, and I only have 2 pills, one for blood pressure and one for vitamins. I know exactly when to take them." Astrid turned to me, her face a look of patient condescension, as if she were explaining something to a small child. "Hubert, it's normal to forget things at your age. Leonard told me how you forgot his birthday last month." I was stunned. Leonard's birthday was in August. It was now October. I couldn't forget about an event that hadn't happened yet. "Leonard's birthday is in August, Astrid, not in September." She froze for a moment, clearly not expecting me to remember the exact date. "Well, maybe I got it wrong. Anyway, the organizers will help you remember to take your pills. That's not a problem, is it?" "Using them?" I realized there was no point in arguing. She wasn't going to recognize my worthiness anyway. "Of course it's no problem," I replied with a fake smile. "Thank you for your concern." But inside I was seething. It wasn't just concern anymore. It was a systematic campaign to paint me as an incapacitated old man. And I was beginning to realize where this was going. If he and Leonard could convince people around me, and maybe even myself, that I wasn't capable of taking care of myself, the next logical step would be guardianship, and then access to my finances would be completely open. 2 days later, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. I came back from my annual physical, quite satisfied with the results. I was in great shape for my age, and all my vitals were normal. Dr. Ramirez even joked that I had the health of a 50-year-old. At home, I found Astrid and Leonard in the living room with a man in an austere suit. They were talking animatedly about something, but the conversation broke off abruptly when I appeared. "Oh, Dad," Leonard looked a little embarrassed. "How was your doctor's appointment?" "Excellent," I replied, shifting my gaze to the stranger. "Good afternoon." The man stood up and extended his hand. "Hello, Mr. Campbell. I'm Raymond Pierce, financial consultant, the same miracle consultant Astrid had tried to foist on me a couple weeks ago." I shook his hand slowly, feeling anger building up inside. "Very interesting," I said, turning to my sister-in-law. I thought I had made it clear that I didn't need the services of a financial advisor. After the financial advisor incident, there was a cold war in the house. Astrid practically stopped talking to me, limiting herself to short phrases as needed. Leonard tried to ease the tension, but his efforts seemed clumsy, as if he were torn between loyalty to his wife and filial duty. I decided to minimize my time at home by taking long walks in the mornings and visiting the town library in the afternoons. I would return only for dinner, after which I would immediately retreat to my room. This avoidance strategy worked for about a week, until one morning Astrid intercepted me at the front door. "Hubert, we need to talk," she said with sudden determination. "Now!" I tensed inwardly, but tried to keep my expression calm. "Of course, Astrid. About what?" "Not here. Let's go into the living room." Leonard was already sitting in the living room. He looked nervous and avoided my gaze, which alerted me immediately. Dad, sit down." He pointed to the chair across from the couch, where he and Astrid sat side by side, presenting a united front. I sank slowly into the chair, feeling the atmosphere thicken. Something told me this conversation wasn't going to do any good. "So," I began as the pause lengthened, "what did you want to talk about?" Leonard and Astrid exchanged glances, and then she put her hand on her husband's knee, as if giving him permission to begin. "Dad, Astrid and I are worried about you," he began. "Lately, we've noticed certain changes in your behavior." "Changes?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" You've become forgetful, sometimes irritable, Leonard said carefully, choosing his words. Kidiurum, you accuse Astrid of trying to gain control of your finances. Because it's true, I couldn't help myself. I have proof. You see it? Astrid looked at her husband. This is what I was talking about. Paranoia. It's a classic symptom. I clenched the armrests of my chair, feeling the blood rush to my face. I'm not paranoid, Astrid. I saw my financial records in your office, and the guardianship information for the cognitively impaired elderly. Leonard flinched and turned to his wife. What is he talking about? Astrid was not confused. About him going through my things, obviously, which only confirms my fears. Hubert, I've consulted with a lawyer about options to help you if your condition worsens. It's called foresight, not conspiracy. Us. What about trying to change the contact information for my bank account? I looked her straight in the eye. Is that a precaution too? Astrid held my gaze without a shadow of embarrassment. I have no idea what you're talking about. You see, Leonard? He's inventing things that didn't exist. It's a classic sign of dementia, creating false memories and accusations. I turned to my son. Leonard, do you really believe this nonsense? I worked in a bank for 10 years. I handled millions of dollars worth of financial transactions every day. Do you really think I'm suddenly incapable of managing my own account? Leonard sighed, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. But Astrid squeezed his knee tighter, and it was as if he remembered a prepared text. Dad, Astrid and I have decided that it would be best if we took over your finances temporarily, until you've had a full gerontologist checkup. I felt a chill go down my spine. So that's where they were going with this. Absolutely not, I replied firmly. Tonaim, I don't need to see a gerontologist, and I certainly won't let you handle my money. Astrid pressed her lips together. Unfortunately, Hubert, you have no choice. With those words, she pulled my bank cards out of my cardigan pocket, the two main ones I always carried with me, and even a spare one I kept in my dresser drawer. How? I stammered, realizing she'd searched my room while I was out. It's for your own good, Astrid said, in a tone that was supposed to sound caring, but was actually oozing smugness. We'll give you a reasonable amount for your allowance each week. Everything else will be paid for by us. I couldn't believe my ears. They were going to treat me like a child by giving me pocket money? Give me my cards back, Astrid, I demanded, struggling to stay calm. Now! No, she smiled coldly. In fact, I've already contacted the bank on your behalf and blocked the cards. They are no longer active. This was too much. I jumped to my feet. You have no right. It's illegal to use someone else's identity, to impersonate someone else. Calm down, Dad, Leonard stood up. Astrid didn't impersonate you. She called from my phone when you were around and simply asked you to confirm a few personal details. You gave the information yourself to block the cards. I strained my memory. A week ago, Leonard had actually approached me with my phone, saying something about verifying data for insurance. He asked questions, and I answered without really looking. Was this really a conversation with the bank? How could I have been so naive? It's a scam, I said, my hands trembling. You tricked your own father. Leonard lowered his eyes. It's for your own good, Dad. Stop saying that crap. I raised my voice. What good would it do to deny me access to my own money? Money I've earned honestly? Astrid stood beside her husband, her eyes narrowed. Hubert, this is a temporary measure. As soon as you pass the examination and prove that you are fully competent, we will, of course, give you back control over your finances. I'm not going to prove anything. The burden of proof is on the one making the accusation. If you think I'm incompetent, prove it in court. Don't be so dramatic, Astrid grumbled. No one's talking about a trial. We're just worried about you. Then give me my cards back. No, she shook her head. And don't ask Leonard. He agrees with me. I looked at my son, who was standing next to my wife with a guilty expression on his face. Is it true, Leonard? Do you agree with this robbery? He sighed. Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Just get yourself examined. If there's nothing wrong with you as you claim, what's the problem? The problem is, I muttered, you're treating me like an incapacitated old man. You stole my cards. You tricked me into accessing my accounts. And now you want me to voluntarily agree to the humiliation of having my legal capacity tested? Yes, Astrid replied simply. That's exactly what we want. And if you refuse, we'll be forced to apply for a formal guardianship order. It was a direct threat. I looked at this woman, so beautiful on the outside and so ugly on the inside, and I couldn't believe my son couldn't see her true colors. You're not getting my money, Astrid, I said quietly. Never. She laughed, a ringing, confident laugh. Oh, Hubert, I've already got it. I've blocked all your cards and now you'll just be begging. And by the way, Dr. Finch, the same gerontologist we booked you in to see next week is very attentive to my opinion. I froze. Dr. Finch. The name was familiar to me. Ralph Finch, a young upstart who was known for easily issuing incapacity opinions to elderly clients, especially if their wealthy relatives were interested. At the bank, we had several questionable cases involving his name, although there was never any direct evidence of his bad faith. Is that how you plan to pull this off? I asked, looking Astrid in the eye. Bribe Finch to declare me incompetent? Her smile twitched a little. I don't know what you're talking about. Dr. Finch is a respected specialist. You're imagining things, Hubert. Another sign we'll discuss with the doctor. I turned to Leonard. Son, please come to your senses. What you're doing is not caring. It's financial abuse. Do you really want to be a part of it? Leonard hesitated. I could see it in his eyes, but then Astrid spoke up. Honey, remember what Dr. Klein said about manipulation? It's a classic example. Trying to induce guilt, to make you doubt. My son's face hardened. Dad, I believe we're doing the right thing. Take the test and everything will fall into place. I realized it was useless to talk. Astrid had complete control over Leonard, and I had no leverage. Not yet, anyway. All right, I said, gathering my dignity. I understood your position. Now let me go back to my room. Of course, Astrid nodded, smiling victoriously. Get some rest, and think about our offer. The sooner you agree to be examined, the sooner we can resolve this unpleasant situation. In my room, I let myself exhale. The situation was worse than I'd realized. They didn't just want to control my finances, they were systematically building a case for formal custody. I needed to act quickly. Fortunately, not all of my financial resources were tied up in cards. I kept $500 in cash in my cufflink box, an old habit of having spare cash. I still had access to a safe deposit box at Northern Trust Bank, where I kept securities and a few thousand more in cash. I pulled out my cell phone and called Stanley Prentice, a former colleague, now the regional director of Northern Trust. Stanley, I need your help. It's urgent. After briefly outlining the situation, I got his full support. We will block any attempts to access your accounts without your personal presence at the bank. And Hubert, I'll put you in touch with Clara Donovan at Legal. You're going to need a good lawyer. After that conversation, I began to formulate a plan. Astrid thought she had me cornered, but she forgot who she was dealing with. I'd worked at the bank for 10 years and knew the system inside out. I had the connections, the knowledge, and most importantly, the determination to fight for my independence and dignity. And I intended to teach my daughter-in-law a lesson she would not forget for the rest of her life. The next morning, I woke up with a firm intention to act decisively. As my Rosemary used to say, when cornered, a rat is more dangerous than a lion. Well, it was time to show that an old banker could be quite dangerous when cornered. I called a cab and booked a car for 10 o'clock in the morning. To my surprise, Astrid, who usually kept an eye on all my movements, was strangely indifferent today. She didn't even come out of her room while I was eating breakfast in the kitchen. Leonard had already left for work, leaving a note saying he'd be back late. Everything was going well. Nobody was preventing me from leaving. After packing a small bag with the essentials and stashing $500 in cash in my jacket pocket, I left the house without a hitch. The cab was already waiting. My first destination was the Northern Reserve, a bank where I was known and remembered. Stanley Prentice greeted me at the entrance to his office with genuine warmth. He was about 20 years younger than me, but over the years we had become good friends. He was now a regional director himself, with his own spacious office. Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice, I said when we sat down. No problem, Hubert. You know I'm always willing to help. Stanley looked worried. I made some inquiries after our conversation. The situation is really complicated. What did you find out? Your sister-in-law called the Western Reserve 3 times in the last 2 weeks. The first time she tried to get your account information, but was turned down because she didn't have power of attorney. The second time she called with Leonard, and he confirmed some personal information. And yesterday she actually blocked your cards under the pretext that you were a victim of fraud. I shook my head. That's a lot of nerve. But she forgot that I have old connections in the Northern Reserve. Exactly. She didn't make an attempt at our bank. She probably knew they remembered you here. But Hubert, it's only a matter of time. If she gets a report from this Dr. Finch— It won't come to that, I interrupted him. I have a plan, but first we need to secure my funds. For the next 2 hours, Stanley and I worked to regain control of my finances. First, I opened a new account with the highest level of security. Access required my personal presence and biometric verification. Then we contacted Western Reserve, and using my credentials and Stanley's status, got the old cards unlocked. After that, I transferred almost all of the funds to the new account, leaving only a minimal balance so that Astrid wouldn't immediately notice the change if she gained access. Your money is safe now, Stanley said, but it's not enough. Your sister-in-law won't stop. You need a long-term defense plan. I'm working on it, I replied. Clara Donovan has agreed to meet with me today. She'll help with the legal side of things, Stanley nodded. Clara is an excellent choice. But while you're strategizing your defense, I'd like to offer you a little help of a different kind. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a file folder. Oh, these are account statements for your son and his wife. We don't normally provide this information, but given the circumstances and the fact that Leonard listed you as a trustee when he opened the account many years ago, I took the folder with some hesitation. Normally, I didn't approve of invasions of privacy, even when my son was involved. But now the situation was exceptional. What I discovered in the documents shocked me. Over the past year, my son's financial situation had deteriorated dramatically. He had several large withdrawals on his account, totaling almost $100,000. At the same time, Astrid's account was regularly receiving large sums of money from Phoenix Consulting, a firm I had never heard of from Leonard. Even more disturbing was that they had taken out a second mortgage on the house just 3 months ago for an impressive sum. Considering they'd recently finished a roof repair, to which I'd given $5,000, it seemed odd. I made a few notes in my notebook and closed the folder. Something didn't add up here, and I intended to get to the bottom of it. At 2 o'clock, I was already sitting in the office of Clara Donovan, an elegant woman of 45, with a sharp mind and a reputation as a ruthless family lawyer. Mr. Campbell, she shook my hand with confident strength. Stanley told me about your situation. I must say that I've come across similar cases of financial abuse, but rarely has the victim been a former bank employee. There's a certain irony to that, I agreed. I've spent my whole life teaching people to protect their finances, and now I'm the one getting hit. But you have an advantage, Clara said. Sure can. You know how the system works, and you have me. We spent the next hour discussing legal strategy. Clara suggested several options, from a temporary restraining order to a lawsuit for damages for the illegal use of my bank cards. But before we start legal battles, Clara said, I'd recommend gathering more information about your daughter-in-law and son's financial situation. According to your story, Astrid may have manipulated not only your money, but Leonard's as well. If we can prove that, he might come over to your side. I have some data. I showed her a folder from Stanley, but I'm not sure it's enough. Clara looked through the documents, making notes. Interesting. This company, Phoenix Consulting, pays your sister-in-law a substantial amount of money, but it doesn't look like a regular salary. It looks more like commissions or fees for individual projects. I've never heard of her working with this company, I remarked. We can check that out, Clara made a note. I have an acquaintance at the IRS. He can give us information about Phoenix Consulting, who the owners are, what they do. What about the second mortgage? I asked. Why did they need that kind of money? That's a good question, Clara nodded, especially since your sister-in-law has been inquiring about your finances in recent months. Perhaps they're in debt? But from where? Leonard earns a good salary. Astrid earns a good salary as a PR consultant. They don't have kids. I haven't noticed any big spending. People often hide financial problems even from their closest friends, Clara said. Sometimes these problems are related to things they don't talk about at family dinner. A gambling addiction, for example, or failed investments. The thought that my son might have been hiding serious financial problems was painful, but I had to know the truth. What do you suggest? First, we need more information, Clara replied. I'll have a friend of mine check out Phoenix Consulting. And you? Do you still have access to your son's house? I have keys, if that's what you mean. Oh, that's great. Then you should look for documents related to the second mortgage, usually kept in a home safe or a study. You might find the answers to your questions there. I didn't really like the idea of going through Leonard's things, but I knew I had no choice. We agreed to meet in 2 days, and I left Clara's office feeling like I was finally starting to regain control of the situation. That evening, I called Leonard. He answered almost immediately, his voice sounding worried. Dad, where are you? Astrid and I came home and found you gone. Are you all right? I'm perfectly fine, son, I answered calmly. I've decided to live apart for a while to think things over. But where did you go? I could hear the bewilderment in his voice. Why would I leave without saying a word? After last night's conversation, it became evident to me that my presence in your house was creating a certain tension. I've decided to give us all a break. There was silence on the line. Then Leonard asked more quietly, You're mad at us, aren't you? About the cards? I'm not angry, Leonard. I'm disappointed and concerned. But I don't want to discuss this over the phone. Let's meet tomorrow. Talk privately. Alone? He hesitated. You mean without Astrid? Exactly. I only want to talk to you, son. It's important. Leonard hesitated. I could almost physically feel him wavering between loyalty to his wife and his duty as a son. All right, he said at last. Where and when? We agreed to meet at lunchtime at a small restaurant near his office. After talking to my son, I called Edward Simmons, a former bank supervisor with whom I was on friendly terms. Edward, although retired, retained many connections and could provide valuable information about Phoenix Consulting. Hubert, the old sea wolf, he exclaimed when he heard my voice. Haven't heard from you in ages. How are you? I've been better, Edward, I said honestly, and briefly described my situation. It's a lousy business, Edward whistled. But don't worry, we'll get that red fox out of here. Phoenix Consulting, you say? Let me see what I've got on them. Edward, despite his 70 years, had an excellent grasp of modern technology. Well. Interesting company, founded 3 years ago. The main focus is corporate mergers and acquisitions consulting, owned by one Richard Thorne. Does that name mean anything to you? No. I shook my head, though Edward couldn't see it. I'd never heard it. It's familiar to me. Edward's voice was conspiratorial. Richard Thorne had been involved in a financial fraud case in 2015. His company had provided consulting services for the merger of two corporations. It was essentially corporate espionage. They leaked insider information to interested parties. Thorne avoided jail time, but his reputation was destroyed. And now he's paying my sister-in-law substantial sums, I said thoughtfully. For what, I wondered. We can find out, Edward said. I still have contacts in the regulatory agencies. I'll make some calls, see what I can dig up. The next day I met Leonard at the place I'd arranged. He looked tired and nervous, with dark circles under his eyes. As we sat down at a table in the far corner of the restaurant, I noticed him looking around anxiously, as if afraid someone might be listening. Are you okay, son? I asked as the waiter took our order and stepped away. Yeah, it's just a lot of work, he rubbed his temples. And at home. Things haven't been going well at home. Because of me? Not only that, Leonard sighed. Dad, listen, about your cards, it was Astrid's idea. I agreed because she convinced me it was necessary for your safety, but now I'm not so sure. What made you hesitate? He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. After you left, Astrid was strange. Not upset that you'd left, but rather annoyed. She called the bank right away to check on your accounts. And when she found out that you transferred most of the money, she went ballistic. You bet she did, I grinned. Her plan had failed. I showed my son copies of the bank statements. Leonard, what are these payments from Phoenix Consulting? And why did you need a second mortgage for such a large amount? Leonard's face stretched in surprise. Where did you get these documents? Doesn't matter. I pulled the papers closer to him. Naderan, what's important is what it says. Leonard took the documents with trembling hands. His face gradually turned pale. Yeah, I didn't know about the payments from this company, he said at last. Astrid had said she was taking on additional projects, but she hadn't mentioned the name of the firm. And the second mortgage? He hesitated. That's for investments. Astrid said she had an opportunity to invest in a promising project. Promised we'd double it in a year. And you agreed to put a mortgage on a house without finding out the details? I was amazed at my son's naivete. I trust my wife. Leonard looked up at me, but there was doubt in his eyes. She knows finances better than I do. Son, I put my hand on his shoulder. I'm afraid your wife is involved in some shady business. This company, Phoenix Consulting, is owned by a man with a criminal record. And your money, it may already be lost. Leonard sat in silence, digesting what he'd heard. I could see distrust, fear, and glimmers of understanding struggling in his eyes. What do I do? He finally asked quietly. For starters, don't tell Astrid about our conversation, I answered. I'm working with a lawyer to get to the bottom of all this. And I have friends who are helping to gather information about Phoenix Consulting. Once we have concrete facts, we'll decide what to do next. What about your cards? I can give them back to you. No need, I smiled. I've already regained control of my finances. But it's important that you're on my side, son, because I'm afraid we're going to have a tough battle ahead of us. After my conversation with Leonard, I returned to the boarding house with the feeling that the gears of my plan were beginning to turn. Sowing doubt in my son's mind was only the first step. Now I had to gather hard evidence of Astrid's machinations and present it in a way that even a love-blinded Leonard couldn't deny. That evening, Edward called with new information about Phoenix Consulting. Hubert, you won't believe what I found, he said with excitement in his voice. Remember I told you that the SEC is watching this company? Well, they already have a file on Richard Thorne, and it's pretty thick. They suspect him of running a whole insider trading ring. And Astrid, I asked impatiently, anything about her? Her name doesn't appear directly, but the persons of interest list includes a public relations consultant working with companies in the telecommunications sector. No name listed, but the profile looks a lot like your sister-in-law. I whistled. So they're already on her trail? Not exactly, Edward clarified. They're gathering information, but they need more concrete evidence for an official investigation. And that's where you might be able to help, if you find anything substantial. I'm working on it, I answered. But I need access to my son's house when Astrid isn't there. I don't want Leonard to be there either. I don't want to put him in danger. That makes sense, Edward agreed. Keep me informed. The next morning I got a call from Clara Donovan. Mr. Campbell, I have good news. I've prepared the paperwork for a temporary restraining order prohibiting your daughter-in-law and son from doing anything with your financial accounts. Judge Porter will consider our application tomorrow morning. Great, I was pleased with the progress. What about Phoenix Consulting? Was your contact able to find out anything? Yes, and the information is interesting. Clara lowered her voice, even though we were on the phone. No forno. Phoenix Consulting is under scrutiny not only by the SEC, but also by the IRS. They suspect the company of evading taxes through a complex scheme involving offshore accounts. And my sister-in-law is getting money from them, I said thoughtfully. Exactly. This could be very serious, Mr. Campbell. If your daughter-in-law knowingly participates in this scheme, she could face not only civil, but criminal liability. I felt a prick of conscience. Despite everything Astrid had done, the thought that she might end up in jail did not give me pleasure. Primarily because of Leonard, he still loved this woman, no matter how calculating she was. Sovereign, let's focus on my immediate problem for now, I said to Clara. I need to protect my finances and help my son see the truth. The rest is up to the proper authorities. Whatever you say, Clara replied, but keep in mind that if we find direct evidence of financial crimes, we may have a duty to report it. After talking to Clara, I called Leonard again. He didn't answer right away, and when he finally did, his voice sounded strained. Dad, I can't talk right now. I'm at work. Is everything okay, son? I asked, sensing something wrong. Yeah, it's just... He's a little confused. Look, Astrid's going to Chicago for 2 days. Business trip. She's flying out tonight. I understand, I answered carefully, trying to figure out where he was going with this. I have to leave too. A business trip to Philadelphia, Leonard said curtly, as if he was afraid of being overheard. The house would be empty until Friday. Now I understood. Leonard was giving me the opportunity to search the house in their absence. Thanks for the information, son, I said. Take care of yourself. You too, Dad, he paused. Yeah, I did some checking about what you were talking about, and I found, strange things. Surely, we'll talk about it when you get back, I assured him. In the meantime, focus on your work, and don't let Astrid know anything's wrong. When I hung up, I contacted Edward right away and told him about the opportunity. It's a great opportunity, he agreed, but you shouldn't go alone. If it's really serious, you'd better have a witness. Are you offering your company? I grinned. Why not? Edward chuckled. I worked in financial supervision for 10 years. I know where to look for skeletons in closets. We agreed to meet the next day at noon outside Leonard's house. I was sure that both Astrid and my son would be gone by then. The next morning I went to the courthouse with Clara. Judge Porter, a gray-haired woman with a shrewd eye, listened carefully to our motion for a temporary restraining order. So your sister-in-law took your bank cards and blocked them without your informed consent? She clarified, looking at the documents. Yes, Your Honor, I confirmed. She tricked me into giving her the information she needed to block them, claiming it was an insurance check. The judge shifted her gaze to Clara. Where is the evidence of this deception? We have a recording of the phone call with the bank, Your Honor. Clara handed the judge a flash drive. Western Reserve Bank provided us with the recording upon official request. It clearly shows my client's sister-in-law introducing herself as his assistant and manipulating the conversation to obtain the necessary data to block the cards. Judge Porter listened to the tape, her face growing increasingly grim. This is a serious offense, she finally said. I'm issuing a temporary restraining order prohibiting Astrid Fallon and Leonard Campbell from dealing with Hubert Campbell's financial accounts without his notarized written consent. The injunction is effective immediately and shall remain in effect until the conclusion of the proceedings on the merits. I felt a huge sense of relief. My finances were now protected, not only technically, but legally. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. Don't thank me, Mr. Campbell. The judge looked at me with unexpected sympathy. Elder financial abuse is a growing problem in our society, and it's especially sad when it comes from family members. I'm glad you found the strength to stand up to it. As I left the courthouse, I felt a surge of energy. The first part of my plan had succeeded. Now neither Astrid nor even Leonard could access my accounts. You look pleased, Clara said with a smile. I am, I confirmed, but that was just the beginning. At noon, I met Edward at Leonard's house. My old friend, despite his age, looked alert and energetic. Son, ready for a little detective work? He asked, shaking my hand. More than ready. I pulled out my keys. Let's start in Astrid's office. That's probably where the most valuable information is. We entered the house, and I led Edward to the second floor, where Astrid's office was located. The room was as neat as I remembered it, not a single piece of paper on the desk, all the books in rows on the shelves. Too perfect, Edward said, looking around. People with secrets are usually very meticulous about organizing their spaces. We began a methodical search, careful not to disturb things. We found the standard office supplies in the desk drawers, a few folders of Astrid's work papers, nothing special. Check the computer, Edward suggested. People often forget about digital footprints. Astrid's laptop was password protected, but after a few tries, I managed to find it. She'd used Leonard's birth date with her initials. Not very original for someone involved in questionable financial transactions, Edward grinned. We started going through the files and emails. This was where the real treasure was. In a separate folder, labeled simply FC, there was correspondence with Richard Thorne, the owner of Phoenix Consulting. The letters discussed projects, information, and compensation. Of particular interest was a letter from 3 weeks ago. Thanks for the update on GT's planned merger with VH. The information has proven to be extremely valuable. The promised $30,000 has been transferred to your offshore account. As for your question about additional funding, I am willing to provide another $50,000 in exchange for details on GT's technology strategy for the next quarter. GT is Global Telecom, where Leonard works, I explained to Edward. And VH must be Vertex Holdings, their competitor. The merger of those companies is strictly confidential, or at least it was supposed to be. It sounds like your sister-in-law is dealing in insider information. Edward shook his head. And she's probably getting it through your son. The question is whether Leonard knows what she's up to, I said thoughtfully. We continued our search and soon came across another interesting folder, Personal Finance. It contained documents relating to Astrid's personal finances, including bank statements that Leonard didn't know about, including an account in the Cayman Islands, which apparently received money from Phoenix Consulting. That explains the second mortgage, I said, looking through the documents. Astrid used the money to invest through offshore accounts, probably to hide the source of the income from the IRS. And from her husband, Edward added, this woman is playing a dangerous game. In the safe, which Astrid, to my surprise, had left unlocked again, we found even more compromising documents, among them a contract between Astrid and Phoenix Consulting, which clearly stipulated her role in providing confidential information about the telecommunications sector. Nas somos, that's direct evidence, Edward whistled. You could go to the SEC with that. And ruin my son's career in life? I shook my head. No, I have to talk to Leonard first. He needs to learn the truth from me, not from the news of his wife's arrest. We made copies of all the documents we found, carefully putting the originals back where they belonged. Then I checked another hiding place behind a bookshelf in my former room, where I kept some personal documents. Fortunately, Astrid hadn't discovered it, and my will, insurance policy, and some other important papers were still intact. After leaving the house, Edward and I went to his home to quietly study the materials we had collected. What are you going to do with this information? Edward asked as we settled into his cozy office. I'm going to talk to Leonard first, I decided. He needed to know what his wife had gotten him into. Then, depending on his reaction, we'd decide how to proceed. What if he took his wife's side? I sighed. Then I will have no choice. I will protect myself and my money, even if it means hurting my son. Leonard returned from his business trip ahead of Astrid. He called me Friday morning, sounding worried. Dad, we need to talk. I found, something in Astrid's papers, something that's really bothering me. I know, son, I replied calmly. I have information you should know too. Where can we meet? We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe in the center of town. When I arrived, Leonard was already waiting for me, pale and puffy, looking like a man who hadn't slept for several nights in a row. Dad, he hugged me tightly. I'm sorry. I was such an idiot. Don't blame yourself, I patted his back. Love can be blinding. We sat down at a table in the far corner where no one could overhear us. Leonard pulled a folder of documents out of his briefcase. I found these in Astrid's office. She thought she'd hidden them well, but Anyway, I started to suspect something was wrong after we talked, so I decided to check it out. I went through the documents, and they were copies of the same files that Edward and I had found on Astrid's computer, plus some additional emails. Do you know what this means? I asked cautiously. Yes. Leonard clenched his fists. She was using me, using the information I'd unknowingly brought home. Documents from work, phone conversations she could hear. She collected it all and sold it to this Thorne. What about the second mortgage? I asked. And where did the money go? I checked. Leonard looked even more depressed. She transferred it to an account in the Cayman Islands, an account I didn't even know about, nor the tens of thousands of dollars she was receiving from Phoenix Consulting. What are you going to do about it? Leonard looked up at me with a determination I hadn't seen in my son in a long time. I already did. I called Global Telecom Security and told them everything. They're starting an internal investigation. I also filed a fraud report with the police. Astrid forged my signature on some documents related to the second mortgage. I was struck by my son's determination. This is a serious step, Leonard. Do you realize that Astrid could be behind bars? I do, he grinned bitterly. But you know what? I don't feel any regret. She didn't just use me, jeopardizing my career and reputation. She tried to steal from my father, the man who has always supported us. It's unforgivable. I put my hand on my son's shoulder. I'm proud of you. It takes a lot of courage to admit you've been cheated, and even more to do something about it. We talked for several more hours discussing the next steps. Leonard decided to file for divorce immediately. He also planned to talk to a lawyer about the possibility of having the second mortgage invalidated due to forged signatures. "What about your money, Dad?" he asked. Astrid tried to get control of it. "Are you going to take any legal action?" "I already have," I replied. "I have a temporary restraining order prohibiting her and you from doing anything with my accounts without notarized authorization." "Right," Leonard nodded, "and I'm sorry I was complicit in her plan. I really believe we were doing this for your good." "I know, son, and I don't hold it against you." As we were leaving the cafe, Leonard suddenly stopped. "Dad, I just realized now that Astrid is coming back tonight. I don't want to be under the same roof with her." "You can stay at my old house," I suggested. "I was planning on going back there anyway. We'll have something to work on together. The house has been a little neglected since I left." "Thank you," Leonard hugged me again. "I don't deserve a father like that." "Yes, you do," I said confidently. "Everyone deserves a second chance, and I'm glad we can start over." That evening, as Leonard and I settled into my old house, the phone rang. It was Clara Donovan. "Mr. Campbell, I've just received some information. Astrid Fallon was detained at the airport trying to leave the country. She was found in possession of a substantial amount of cash and offshore accounts." "Was she trying to escape?" I was shocked. "It would appear so. Maybe she found out about the internal investigation at your son's company. Either way, she's testifying now. And from what I've learned, there are serious charges ranging from fraud to money laundering to insider trading." I thanked Clara for the information and hung up. Leonard, who had heard part of the conversation, looked at me anxiously. "Had Astrid been arrested?" he asked. "Detained," I clarified. "She was trying to leave the country." Leonard shook his head. "I should have known she would try to escape. She always thought of herself first." "Well, now she'll have to answer for her actions," I said, "and you and I will move on. We have a home, we have each other, and now we have complete financial independence from Astrid's manipulations." Leonard smiled weakly. "You know, Dad, I'm just now realizing how strong you are. At 74, you stood up to a young, calculating woman who tried to take everything from you, and you won. It's not about strength, son." I looked out the window at the setting sun. "It's about experience and knowledge. Sometimes they're more important than physical strength or youth. And that's the advantage of age. Years give you wisdom you can't get otherwise." That evening, sitting in an old armchair in the living room of my house, with my son finally free of Astrid's toxic influence, I felt a strange peace. The battle had been won, my finances were safe, and my son's reputation and career, though damaged, could be restored. Most importantly, we were a family again, without the lies and manipulation between us. 3 months had passed since Astrid's arrest. Winter shrouded Ontario in a fluffy blanket of snow, turning the streets into fairy tale paths among the drifts. I sat by the fireplace in my old house on River Street, watching the flames dance among the logs, and reflected on how much my life had changed over the months. After Astrid's arrest, events unfolded rapidly. She was charged with fraud, money laundering, and insider trading. Bail was set at such an amount that even with her hidden savings, she couldn't post it. So now my sister-in-law was in custody, awaiting trial, which was scheduled to begin in a month. Leonard, who had initially moved in with me, 2 weeks later rented a small apartment near his work. He offered to let me live together again, but I politely declined. The experience taught me to value my independence and personal space. Besides, we both needed time to lick our wounds and process what had happened. As for Leonard's company, Global Telecom, they conducted an internal investigation and recognized my son as a victim of circumstance. He had no knowledge of his wife's shenanigans and had no intention of sharing confidential information with third parties. Nevertheless, his reputation suffered. Colleagues looked at him with suspicion, and management moved him to a less responsible position with a corresponding pay cut. "Somewhere, I could quit, find another job," he told me during one of our weekly lunches. But that would look like an admission of guilt. I have to prove myself trustworthy. I was proud of his determination. Despite the odds, Leonard had found the strength to fight for his reputation and his career. He had changed. More serious, more thoughtful. In a way, the whole horrible experience helped him grow up and start taking responsibility for his life. As for me, after getting an injunction restraining Astrid from doing anything with my finances, I regained full control of my accounts. Clara Donovan helped me set up a trust, a legal structure that protected my assets from any future encroachment. Now, even if someone tried to challenge my capacity, my money would still be safe. The house on River Street, which had been vacant during my stay with my son, needed repairs. I hired a construction crew and completely renovated the roof, the heating system, and the kitchen. The result exceeded all expectations. Now my house was not only cozy, but also modern, with the latest technology to facilitate the life of an elderly person. In parallel with home improvement, I started to take care of my health. Regular visits to Dr. Sullivan, the same gerontologist Clara had recommended, showed that I was in excellent shape for my age. However, I began to follow a more rigorous regimen of daily walks, special exercises to maintain flexibility, and a Mediterranean diet. "You're remarkably strong for 74, Mr. Campbell," Dr. Sullivan said at our last meeting. "If you keep this up, you may well live to be 100. That prospect did not frighten me. On the contrary, after all I'd been through, I had a new zest for life. Instead of quietly living out my life in my son's house, as Astrid had originally planned, I was actively engaged in social activities. Stanley Prentice offered me a position as a consultant at Northern Trust. 2 days a week, I came to the bank and shared my experience with young employees. Not only did this bring in extra income, but it also gave me a sense of demand. I also joined the local senior citizens club, where I quickly made new friends. Every Wednesday we played chess, and on weekends we organized excursions to neighboring towns. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was part of a community, not a burden to my loved ones. The only thing that marred my new life was thoughts of Leonard. Despite our reconciliation and the rebuilding of trust, I could see how hard things were for him. Astrid's betrayal had left a deep scar on his soul. He began seeing a therapist, but the healing process was long and painful. One evening, as we sat on my veranda drinking hot tea and watching the snow fall, Leonard suddenly opened up. "You know, Dad, I still can't believe I was so blind. How could I not see who she really was?" "Love often clouds the mind," I replied, looking at the dancing snowflakes. "We see what we want to see and miss the obvious." "But you noticed," he turned to me. "You knew right away that something was wrong with her. Rosemary sensed it too." I sighed, remembering what my late wife had said about the predatory in Astrid. "You can always tell from the outside. Besides, your mom and I had the advantage of years of experience. We'd seen all kinds of people and learned to recognize falseness." "I was an idiot," Leonard grinned bitterly. "Even when you tried to open my eyes, I chose her side." "I'm sorry for that, Dad. You have nothing to apologize for." I put my hand on his shoulder. "You loved her and trusted her. It's not your fault." Leonard shook his head. "Astrid's lawyer contacted me yesterday. He offered me a deal. If I testified that I knew about her actions and approved of them, she'd split the money she'd stashed in offshore accounts with me." I froze. "What did you say?" "I told him to go to hell," Leonard grinned. "Said I'd rather lose everything than have my honor tarnished by a lie." Pride overflowed in my heart. My son, despite his mistakes and naivety, was a man of principles. "You did the right thing," I said, shaking his hand. "Money comes and goes, but your reputation and self-respect stay with you forever." Astrid's trial began in February. I didn't attend, but Leonard went every day. He felt it was his duty to see the trial through to the end, to get final closure on this chapter of his life. She's not the woman I fell in love with," he said after the first day of hearings. "Cold, calculating, without a shadow of remorse. It's like the mask has come off and I can finally see her real face." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Witness testimony, expert reports, mountains of documents. Everything pointed to Astrid's guilt. Finally, the court handed down a sentence of 8 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5 years. In addition, she had to pay a large fine and compensation to the companies affected by her actions. When Leonard told me about the verdict, I asked him how he felt. "Relief," he replied after a long pause, "and emptiness. Like a part of me had died with our marriage." "Time heals," I assured him. "Right now you think the pain will never go away, but one day you'll wake up and realize you can breathe again." "You're right," Leonard nodded. "By the way, I've been offered a transfer to the Vancouver branch of the company. New position, new city, new start. I'm thinking of accepting." The news of my son's possible departure touched something deep inside me. On the one hand, I understood his desire for a fresh start, away from painful memories and stares. On the other, the thought of him being so far away was unsettling. You have to do what you think is right, I said, hiding my mixed feelings. If Vancouver is what you need right now, I'll support your decision. Thank you, Dad. Leonard smiled gratefully. Your support means more to me than you can imagine. At the end of February, Leonard accepted the transfer offer and began preparing for the move. We spent a lot of time together, enjoying the last few weeks of intimacy. He helped me with minor repairs around the house, and I shared recipes and wisdom, the simple things Rosemary had once taught me. Our house in the suburbs, where the whole Astrid thing happened, was for sale. After paying off the second mortgage and other debts, Leonard didn't have much money left over, but he wasn't discouraged. Money isn't everything, he said as he helped me paint the porch. I had learned that lesson the hard way. In early March, a week before Leonard left, I threw a little farewell dinner. I invited Stanley and his wife, Edward Simmons, Clara Donovan, and a few other friends who had supported us through the difficult times. It was a warm and heartwarming evening. We recounted funny stories, discussed future plans, and gave Leonard advice about life in Vancouver. No one mentioned Astrid or the court. It was a taboo subject. After the guests left, my son and I sat on the veranda for a long time, gazing at the starry sky. I'm going to miss you, Dad, Leonard said quietly. I'll miss you too, son, I said, feeling a lump in my throat. But there are phones now, video calls, and you can always fly down for the weekend. I will, he nodded, and you should come visit me when I'm settled in. Vancouver's a beautiful city. You'll love it. Senim. Okay, I smiled, imagining the trip. Maybe in the summer, when the weather is good for old bones like mine. Leonard laughed. Come on, Dad. You're in better shape than a lot of people my age. Dr. Sullivan says you could live to be 100 years old. We'll see, I winked at him. Anyway, I'm not going to sit around and wait for old age. I have too many plans. Like what, for instance? Leonard was interested. Well, for one thing, I want to travel. Your mother and I have always dreamed of seeing Europe, but we put it off until later. Now I realize that later may not come. So this summer, I'm planning a trip to Italy. By yourself? My son was surprised. Why not? I shrugged. I am quite an independent person. Besides, the senior club organizes group tours. I've already signed up for a trip in June. Leonard shook his head with a smile. You're amazing, Dad. After everything that happened, many people would have shut down, afraid of new people and experiences. But you're the opposite, as if you found a second youth. Not a second youth, I corrected him. I just finally realized that age is not a sentence, but just a number. It's not how old you are, it's how you feel and what you do with your life. We talked late into the night, sharing plans and dreams. Leonard talked about projects he wanted to do in Vancouver. I talked about my ideas for traveling and community service. On the day of my son's departure, I walked him to the airport. The goodbye was touching, but not sad. We both knew that we were not parting forever, and that our bond had grown stronger after all the trials. Take care of yourself, Dad, Leonard said, hugging me tightly before we landed. And don't let anyone tell you how to live your life. You too, son, I said, patting him on the back. And remember, a new beginning is not an escape from the past, but a chance to build a better future. When Leonard's plane took off, I was in no hurry to leave the airport. Sitting by the panoramic window with a cup of coffee, I reflected on the vicissitudes of fate that had brought us to this moment. Until 6 months ago, I had been living in my son and daughter-in-law's house, gradually losing control of my life. Astrid had methodically undermined my autonomy by portraying me as a feeble old man, unable to make decisions. And if it hadn't been for my banking background, my connections and knowledge accumulated over decades of work, who knows how it would have ended. Now I was completely independent, financially, emotionally, physically. I lived in my own house, managed my own money, made plans for the future without regard for other people's opinions. And although separating from my son was bittersweet, I knew it was the best thing for both of us. Leonard needed to start a new chapter away from painful memories. Me to enjoy some well-deserved freedom after decades of working and caring for my family. Sometimes toxic relationships are better broken than maintained, a truth I've learned through experience. And even though the road to that realization was thorny, the result was worth every minute of suffering and struggle. Finishing my coffee and looking at the airplanes taking off, I felt a wonderful peace. Life went on. A new chapter, new opportunities, new horizons. And I was ready for this journey, no matter what surprises it held in store.